I remember that freezing February morning, 6 o'clock, with a cold that bit straight through my jacket. A brand new white Lexus SUV, plate reading RULZGRL, sat dead center in my winter wheat field. I stood in my mud-caked boots, coffee steaming in my hand, while my blue heeler Grit growled in slow circles around the vehicle. Behind me, the low diesel rumble of my idling excavator cut through the frost. That machine cost more than my barn and tractor combined. Beverly stepped out with no apology. She just looked me up and down and said, "Smooth as honey. We just need to do a little surveying, Mr. Warden. This is for the good of the community." 2 years, 11 complaints, and thousands in legal fees, all from a woman standing uninvited on my land, calling it the good of the community. At the time, I just took a slow sip of coffee, looked over at that heavy steel excavator bucket hanging right there, and didn't say a single word. Looking back, I wonder what you would have done if you were standing in my boots. You can let me know in the comments, and tell me where you are watching from today. But to understand why that white Lexus eventually ended up surrounded by a 3-foot drainage trench on a cold February morning, you need to know who I am and who Beverly Pruitt is. My name is Colt Warden. I was 58 years old back then, born and raised in Harlan County, Tennessee, and I had been working this 140-acre farm my entire adult life. My grandfather, Elwood Warden, bought this land back in 1951 with money he saved on the railroad and a small loan. My grandfather grew tobacco and corn on this dirt. Eventually, my father expanded the operations into Angus cattle in the 70s, and then added a winter wheat rotation in the 80s. When he passed away 11 years ago, he left me the land, a beat-up Kubota tractor with a cracked manifold, and a solid handshake agreement with 2 neighboring farmers to share equipment during the harvest. Our operation is not glamorous, and it is certainly not a lifestyle brand. It is a real working farm, and it smells like one. We have diesel and turned earth in the spring, dried hay and manure in the fall, and wood smoke with frozen mud in the winter. I wouldn't trade a single acre of it. But then came the wrinkle. About 8 years ago, a developer bought the neighboring 60-acre tract and built Sunrise Estates. Those were nice enough houses, I suppose, with big 2-car garages and decorative plastic shutters bolted to the brick that did not actually shut. The Tillman family took their developer check and moved down to Sarasota, and I could not blame them, since farming that rocky parcel had not been profitable in years. The homeowners association that formed around the neighborhood, which they called SEHA, was initially fine. There were just a few polite letters about trash bins, nothing that ever involved me. My property predated their subdivision by 6 decades, giving me zero legal obligation to them. My attorney, Prescott Hale, confirmed that in 30 seconds. But then Beverly Pruitt moved in. She was a retired human resources director from Nashville who arrived with a quiet, hollowed-out husband. At 62 years old, Beverly always dressed like she was preparing to testify before some congressional subcommittee. She wore sharp blazers, pressed slacks, sensible low heels, and kept her silver hair in a tight bun, with her phone perpetually clutched in her hand to document violations. She spoke with the measured, cold cadences of someone who had spent 30 years drafting corporate performance improvement plans. 18 months after moving in, she ran for president of the Homeowners Association. Since nobody else wanted the job, she ran completely unopposed and won with a grand total of 11 votes. Within 90 days, the letters started arriving. But they were not addressed to her neighbors. They were sent directly to me, claiming my grain silo was an aesthetic nuisance. That grain silo had been standing tall on my land since 1974, while their walking trail was only put in back in 2019. The second notice she sent me complained about my pre-dawn tractor lights, claiming they disrupted the residents' sleep cycles. I had to run lights during the early harvest because farming has hours that simply do not wait for the sun to rise. The third letter was a formal complaint to the county zoning board, signed by Beverly, claiming my livestock operation was a nuisance under a revised 2017 township ordinance. She had actually dug up an obscure amendment to weaponize against me. Although that complaint was eventually dismissed because the board knew my family, it still cost me $800 and 2 vital days during calving season. Those were the worst 2 days to be stuck dealing with legal paperwork instead of tending to my newborn calves. That spring, I decided to address Beverly directly at a county board meeting, speaking politely but firmly. I told her that my land rights were ironclad, my agricultural operations were completely lawful, and I would appreciate it if she focused her energy on the subdivision she was actually elected to govern. She just smiled at me the way a seasoned chess player smiles when you make a bad move. "Mr. Warden," she said coolly, "every community has a character, and sometimes that character requires updating." Looking back, that exchange happened exactly 11 months before I found her Lexus parked in my wheat field, and that summer turned out to be brutal. It was the kind of dry Tennessee July, where the corn tassels turn brown at the edges by noon, and the cattle stand hip-deep in the creek all day just to stay cool. I was working grueling 16-hour days, running entirely on black coffee and old habit, when a certified letter arrived from the county planning department. Beverly had submitted a formal application requesting a mandatory vegetative buffer ordinance along my western property boundary. Essentially, she wanted to legally force me to plant a dense row of approved trees along my own fence line, at my own expense, to hide my working farm from her subdivision. The estimated cost of this ridiculous planting requirement was somewhere between $12,000 and $18,000. I was being told to buy trees I did not want, on land I owned, to hide my farm from folks who willingly chose to buy a house next to an active farm. I read that letter twice at my kitchen table, while the thermometer hit 94 degrees and the window unit struggled. The kitchen smelled of coffee grounds and axle grease, while Grit watched me with that quiet concern dogs show when their humans go silent. I laid the paper down, went outside, and split a quarter cord of oak firewood before making my call. It is an old method to clear the mind, but it works. Then I called Prescott Hale. He was 71 years old, drove a 2009 Ford Ranger, and charged legal rates that had not changed much since 2010. Prescott had a memory like a courthouse filing cabinet and zero tolerance for regulatory nonsense. When I explained the buffer issue, he told me that the ordinance did not apply to agricultural land because of an exemption in Section 14-209, which had been on the books since 1998. He filed a formal objection that week, and the application was rejected in September. I made sure to attend the meeting, and so did Beverly, wearing her signature blazer. She watched the commissioner read the rejection with an expression like she had just discovered her coffee was decaffeinated without her consent. I gave her a polite nod as I walked out, but she was absolutely furious. She looked right through me, as if I were nothing but a structural wooden column. Looking back, my biggest takeaway from that victory was that most rural counties have an agricultural exemption in their zoning codes to protect working farms from residential rules. It is all public record and costs nothing to look up. That was round one to the farm, but I made the classic mistake of thinking she would back down. 2 weeks after that planning commission ruling, my neighbor Dorrance Kimball called me. Dorrance ran a third-generation peach orchard on the eastern parcel, had a booming laugh you could hear from the main road, and had absolutely no patience for nonsense. He told me I was going to want to hear what he had to say. Dorrance told me that Beverly was going door to door in her subdivision with a petition, requesting a state agricultural review of my operation due to runoff concerns. I remember sitting down on my porch steps in the evening air, which smelled of honeysuckle and dry grass, while the crickets buzzed as loud as a freight train. When I repeated the words state agricultural review, he confirmed she was also gossiping at the local farmers market, telling my regular buyers that I had severe drainage issues and chemical runoff. That hit me differently than the zoning nonsense. This was a direct attack on my reputation. We had farmed this watershed for 70 years without a single violation, keeping pristine records for 15 years. Mud sticks, especially when someone is actively spreading it at the market where your regular customers shop. I knew I had two choices: react in anger or get methodical. My grandfather always used to say that the man who keeps his head in a fight wins, mostly because the other fellow usually loses his first. So, I went methodical. The very next morning, I contacted the Tennessee Department of Agriculture to request a voluntary compliance inspection. It is a proactive move where you invite state inspectors to walk your land, test everything, and document the results. If you are clean, they issue an official compliance letter. Mine came back completely spotless, signed, stamped, and filed away for safekeeping. I framed that inspection certificate and hung it in my equipment barn, right next to a 1955 photograph of my grandfather plowing these same fields with a two-bottom plow and an old mule named Senator. You and I both know that in any farm dispute, keeping an official, dated record is your best defense against unfair claims. That voluntary inspection made it incredibly hard for anyone to dispute our clean status in court. I also started a detailed written log of every interaction with Beverly or her association, noting the date, time, and what was said. That habit from my 40s became the spine of our defense. By October, the red maples turned, and a cold snap broke the summer's grip. With winter wheat to plant, equipment to winterize before the hard freeze, and a northern pasture fence line needing 4 new posts, I had zero time for distractions. But Beverly did not care, and she decided to target my western access road. It was a simple, unpaved farm road I used to reach my lower fields, consisting of about 400 yards of gravel and clay track that I had graded myself 30 years ago. My grandfather had run a wagon path along that very same route before me. The road sat entirely on my land, 60 feet inside my fence line. Even so, Beverly realized that my tractors kicked up dust on dry days, and she noticed it drifting east across her subdivision fence line. To build her case, Beverly gathered written statements from 4 Sunrise Estates residents, claiming my road dust ruined their car paint and aggravated their allergies. Armed with those, she filed a private nuisance complaint with the county sheriff. Deputy Marvin Ogle, whom I had known since he played third base in Little League, showed up at my door looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Colt, I am real sorry about this. It is just a complaint I am required to log. You do not have to do anything right now." I thanked him, and once he left, I called Prescott. "A private nuisance claim for agricultural road dust," Prescott said, using that deliberate tone he always uses when he is trying not to editorialize. "While it is technically not a frivolous claim, the legal standard for a private nuisance requires substantial interference with their property," Prescott explained to me over the phone. He pointed out that dust from a farm road that had existed for 60 years on agricultural land predating their subdivision would make a tough case for them. It fell squarely under what lawyers call the coming to the nuisance doctrine. As Prescott put it, when you move next to an existing operation and then complain about it, the courts look at who was there first. Our farm predated their houses by decades, and our road was even older than that. It is a powerful legal defense, and you should always research it first. When people build next to an existing business and file complaints, the older farm usually wins, but the process is still exhausting. It took 3 months for the county to dismiss that nuisance complaint, and while we won, it cost me $400 in legal fees. More than that, the constant harassment was wearing on my staff. I had 3 part-time employees, my nephew Taft, a retired mechanic named Odell who could diagnose any engine by ear, and Riva, who ran my books like a federal auditor. One Tuesday, Riva pulled me aside, holding her coffee and keeping her voice low. "Colt, I need to say something," she murmured. "She is not going to stop. Every single week, it is something new. My cousin in Sunrise Estates says Beverly has been speaking at her Thursday neighborhood meetings about petitioning the county to rezone this entire area to rural residential," Riva continued. "If they succeeded, it would destroy my ability to run a commercial agricultural operation on my own land." I looked at her, letting the weight of her words sink in, knowing Riva never dealt in rumors. If she was bringing this to my desk, it was a real and present danger. "Where did this come up?" I asked. "On the whiteboard at their last session, listed as item number 3 under their long-term community vision." That single detail reframed the entire conflict. This was not just a neighbor with a petty grudge. This was a hostile, coordinated strategy. If you have ever dealt with aggressive land developers, you know exactly how this game is played. Their goal was to pile on regulatory complaints, ruin my reputation, and inflate my legal costs until farming this land no longer made economic sense. I had a very strong suspicion about who would be standing there with a purchase offer the second I threw in the towel. I began making quiet, strategic calls to research the players. Within a few weeks, I started uncovering some very interesting connections between Beverly Pruitt and the Ridgecrest Properties Development Company. But before I could do anything with that intelligence, Beverly made an aggressive move that triggered an open confrontation. On a Wednesday morning, she literally blocked my field gate. Behind the orange cones, a young man wearing a safety vest sat at a folding table, holding a clipboard and looking incredibly out of place. I stopped my truck and rolled down the window, breathing in the cold air and pine resin while Dorrance's tractor idled in the distance. When I asked what he was doing, he told me the road was temporarily closed for an environmental survey. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Son, this road is on my private land, and your association has zero authority here. Pack this up now, or I am calling the sheriff." He was gone within 4 minutes, table and all. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line to log the incident, adding the official report number to my growing paper trail. Sticking to my grandfather's old rules, keep your head and keep your records, was the only thing that kept me grounded as winter took hold. January brought the coldest stretch of weather we had seen in 4 years, the kind of deep freeze where the soil rings like iron under your boots. Most mornings, I was out in the excavator digging a drainage ditch in the northern pasture that I had planned for 2 seasons. The diesel engine rumbled through the frost, and the sharp mineral smell of cold hydraulic fluid hung heavy in the air. That was when my nephew Taft came jogging across the open field toward my machine, holding his smartphone out in front of him, as if he were carrying an incredibly fragile piece of glass. What Taft showed me was a public post in the Sunrise Estates Facebook group, left open to the public because Beverly wanted maximum exposure. It was an aerial screenshot of my farm from Google Maps, marked up with red circles and arrows pointing at my outbuildings and creek. The caption claimed that after extensive research, they had identified major environmental violations and reported them to the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. She urged residents to watch and photograph my farm. Within 2 hours, 47 comments had piled up, mostly from panicked homeowners. A few of them had already shared the post to a regional environmental watchdog page, accelerating the spread of her false claims. Although 2 local farmers posted skeptical replies on the thread, the post was rapidly gaining steam. I took a photo of Taft's screen, then phoned Riva and instructed her to archive every single post, comment, and share with a clear timestamp. She had a digital filing system built before I even hung up. Next, I called Prescott, who cut me off to tell me to preserve every piece of it. "This is your strongest evidence," he told me. "In Tennessee, posting false statements of fact about a business online is defamation per se. If this starts causing your buyers or suppliers to question your operation, we can easily document the economic damage and hold them financially responsible. You and I must remember this rule. If anyone ever attacks your livelihood online, you must screenshot everything immediately with visible timestamps. That digital evidence is the foundation of a defamation claim, allowing a business to sue for actual and punitive damages in court." With that in mind, I made a call I had been sitting on for a month. I reached out to Glenwood Fitch, a reporter at the Cookeville Herald-Citizen, who had written an excellent series on rural land rights and development pressure. I did not pitch him a sensational story. I simply invited him to come walk the farm, look over our state compliance files, and meet with Prescott so he could see the facts for himself. There was no hidden agenda, just a simple invitation to look at the facts of what we had been dealing with for 2 years. Glenwood drove out to the farm on a cold Thursday in late January. He spent 3 hours with us, walking the creek bank, reading our state compliance letter, and examining the dismissed sheriff complaints. While we stood at the western fence line looking at the subdivision houses through the bare winter trees, he made a deliberately casual comment. "You know, Ridgecrest Properties has been talking with the county about expanding Sunrise Estates," he said. "Phase 2 of their plan requires a lot of extra land." I kept my face completely neutral when he asked if they had made an inquiry about my parcel. Looking back, you and I can see how clearly the pieces were starting to fit together when that reporter gave me his carefully measured non-answer, which was as good as a yes. The truth was finally exposed, validated by an independent investigator who had done his own digging. Beverly Pruitt was far more than a nuisance neighbor with a homeowners association badge. She was serving as a tactical weapon for a corporate developer who wanted my 140 acres for their subdivision expansion. Every petty complaint and toxic online post had been a calculated financial strike to force me out. Listening to the low rumble of my excavator in the freezing air, I realized they had picked the wrong family farm. It was a late Friday afternoon in chilly January when Prescott phoned me, speaking in a slow, highly deliberate tone that I had never heard him use before. He sounded like someone carrying a live explosive, trying to set it down gently without triggering a blast. He told me, "Colt, I have been conducting a thorough title search on the Sunrise Estates land, looking at the original Ridgecrest Properties paperwork from 2016, and I uncovered something in the development agreement that has been completely ignored since the day it was filed. I slowly sat down at my worn wooden kitchen table as my dog Grit rested his heavy head on my knee. He explained that this public document at the county recorder office contained a standard maintenance covenant for the shared utility easement along my western boundary. Hidden deep within that same county filing, however, was a binding 10-year non-harassment clause. It explicitly stated that Ridgecrest Properties, along with its subsidiaries, agents, and any active homeowners association, was legally barred from launching any regulatory, administrative, or legal attacks against adjacent farmers within the designated agricultural buffer zone for a full decade after completion. My hands shook as I set the phone on the wood, only to snatch it back up. I asked him if he was telling me that Beverly, in her official capacity as president of the association, had been violating a legal agreement her own developer partners had signed. He confirmed it immediately, adding that the 10-year restriction would not run out until 2026. A heavy, thick silence settled over our phone line as the full reality of the situation washed over me. Every single frivolous zoning complaint, malicious property filing, and defamatory online attack she made was actually a direct breach of the formal contract the developers had signed with our county. This meant I was sitting on a massive breach of contract claim against an incredibly wealthy corporate entity, on top of 2 years of rock-solid evidence of harassment. Prescott pointed out that this legal mechanism is known as a peaceful use covenant, designed specifically to shield working farms. While state laws vary, he assured me that our local courts in Tennessee had recently upheld this exact protection in 2 separate landmark cases. If you ever find yourself fighting a similar battle, let me share a crucial lesson about how these land developers operate. When corporations build next to active agricultural property, they frequently sign peaceful use agreements just to get county approval, which are kept on file at the local deeds office. If a homeowners association is giving you hell, have your lawyer dig up those original papers. You might discover they already waived their right to harass you. Then, my attorney told me something that made me freeze in my tracks. He warned me not to reveal our hand, to stay quiet, and to let her keep filing complaints because every new action she took would count as a separate, costly breach of contract. According to him, she was going to hand us the entire lawsuit on a silver platter if we just stayed patient. This situation required me to be as still and unmoving as a cedar fence post in the dead of winter. I put my head down, returned to my daily chores, meticulously updated my daily log, and filed away every scrap of incoming evidence. True to her predictable nature, Beverly did not let us down. February is easily the most miserable, bleak month on a working farm in Tennessee, with the ground frozen solid and the cows devouring hay at twice their normal rate. Yet, that biting cold brings an odd, quiet clarity where you can focus entirely on the looming problem without any outside distractions. Riva had compiled 2 full years of meticulously dated logs, printed social media screeds, local sheriff dispatch numbers, and thrown out zoning complaints into a thick black binder. At the same time, I had the local reporter Glenwood Fitch gathering his own stack of public records for a potential news piece. But looking back, I knew a simple legal settlement would never be enough to end this nightmare. I refused to accept a quiet payoff tied to a strict gag order. I wanted a fully transparent, public, and permanent resolution that would go down in county history. When my old friend Dorrance came over on Sunday, we sat on the porch drinking strong coffee and strategized. Having survived 2 property wars himself, he had the kind of hard-earned wisdom I sorely needed. His insights came from a lifetime of making his own mistakes, learning from them, and adapting his approach. He looked at me and said that while my legal defense was rock solid, the court system would take years, and standard settlements always ended in total secrecy. If I wanted her to stop permanently and make sure the whole town knew exactly why she had backed down, I had to treat those as 2 separate challenges. He was absolutely right about that. Letting attorneys hash out a private deal in a closed conference room would only shield her actions and keep her in power at the homeowners association. I needed one loud, public, and undeniable event that would catch her red-handed, prove my legal case, and expose her real agenda. This event had to make it impossible for her to sweep her 2-year campaign of harassment under the rug. Crucially, I needed her to walk right into this trap entirely on her own, without any prodding from my side of the fence. As it turned out, she was already setting her own trap. A relative of Riva who lived inside the subdivision had been sharing updates with us, motivated by a desire to see justice served. She told us that Beverly had been seen patrolling the boundary line with a camera and measuring tools. After my farmhand Taft noticed strange tire tracks near my western gate, we realized she was scheming something that would force her to physically step onto my land to get the measurements she wanted. One chilly Sunday morning, I paced the perimeter of the south field, carefully calculating the angles and layouts of my property. Since January, I had been excavating a legitimate drainage ditch along the northern border, a project that had been approved in a county watershed plan 3 years ago. According to the scheduled timeline, we were about to extend this ditch down toward the lower corner of the field. The gate, right where Taft had spotted those tire tracks, was the only logical entrance for anyone trying to access my western property line. I want to make one thing absolutely clear for the record. I did not set a trap for her, because acting with absolute integrity mattered to my conscience and my legal case. I simply directed my crew to move forward with the drainage excavation exactly as outlined in the official county plans. Following my usual daily routine, I left the access gate unlocked but fully functional. I made sure to run my plans by Prescott first, and he agreed that a property owner is entirely within their legal rights to perform pre-planned work on their own land, even if that work ends up blocking or impacting an illegal vehicle parked on the property. This was not some spontaneous scheme. The excavator was parked in the field, and the county filings had been sitting on record for years. It was just standard winter farm work, identical to what I did every single February. My next step was calling Glenwood Fitch, not to leak a sensational scoop, but merely to let him know I was starting a major drainage project in the South Pasture that he might want to photograph for his ongoing coverage of local agricultural issues. He agreed to meet me out there on Tuesday morning. I sent a quick message to Prescott, noting that Phase 2 of the South Field work would begin the week of the 12th. He sent a brief 2-word reply saying that he knew. I turned in early that night, enjoying the deep, quiet sleep that only comes when the hard planning is finished, and all that is left is to act. But she ended up arriving ahead of schedule on Sunday morning, February 9th, when Taft spotted her luxury car parked deep inside my gate. The car sat there with its engine off, and nobody was in sight when my phone rang at 6:02 a.m. I was already fully dressed with my boots laced up, and the engine heater on the excavator had been warming up for 20 minutes. I drove my truck down to the frozen pasture, stepped out into the crisp air, and breathed in the scent of cold earth and wood smoke. My dog leaped from the cab and began pacing quiet circles around the foreign vehicle, sniffing the tires without making a sound. I pulled out my phone and took high-resolution photos of the car from every angle, making sure my boundary markers and the fresh tire tracks in the frost were clear. After calling in a trespass report to the county sheriff, I messaged the reporter to get his camera ready. Looking back, the whole thing kicked off at exactly 7:15 a.m., when Glenwood pulled up and set up his camera by the fence line with a long lens. He was completely quiet about it, just doing his job as a local journalist to document the day, while I climbed into the cab of my heavy excavator to start my shift. Now let us be completely clear about what happened next, because I know how bad it looks in hindsight, and I want zero ambiguity here. I never once touched her vehicle, nor did I damage it, or even drive the heavy machine anywhere near it. Damaging someone else's property is a criminal act, and that is just not who I am. Instead, I simply continued working on the deep drainage ditch I had been digging since January, keeping strictly to our county-approved watershed plan and extending the trench south in a wide, sweeping arc right around her parked sedan. By the time 9:30 a.m. rolled around, Beverly's fancy Lexus was not buried under dirt, but it was trapped on 3 sides by a freshly dug drainage trench that went down a full 3 feet, with heavy gray clay piled high along the edges. Behind the rear bumper, the only way out was blocked by a long stretch of soft, churned-up earth from my initial entry cut. Driving that luxury car out of there under its own power was absolutely out of the question, and bringing in a commercial tow truck would mean crossing my private field, which legally required my written permission. My buddy Odell stood near the machine barn, arms crossed over his chest, wearing a look of sheer satisfaction as he watched. When he asked me if this was legal, I told him it absolutely was, since I was just executing scheduled watershed work on my own land, and the owner could get her car whenever she wanted, provided she hired a tow. I waited until exactly 10:47 a.m. to send Beverly a very polite, very formal text message, advising her that her vehicle appeared to be parked illegally on my private land. I let her know that I had already filed a formal trespassing report with the local sheriff's department earlier that morning, complete with a report number she could request. I also explained that while her car was technically accessible, she would need to call a professional towing service to extract it because of the active excavation work on my property, suggesting she try Lester's Towing over on Route 9. By 11:15 a.m., she pulled up in Thad's heavy pickup truck alongside Cortland and Peg from the Homeowners Association board, clearly believing a basic tow strap and some horsepower would solve their problem. They all climbed out of the cab and just stared down into the trench in complete silence, before Beverly slowly turned her head to glare at me across the divide. Within less than an hour, that single reality check comment from Wallace racked up 41 likes, prompting a panicked Cortland to delete his supportive remarks, while Peg quietly logged offline. Their little coalition was beginning to fracture right before our eyes, but Beverly was not backing down just yet. Her expensive legal counsel turned out to be a Knoxville lawyer named Duffy, a polished homeowners association specialist who was clearly used to bulldozing rural folks whom he assumed were unrepresented or completely unprepared. He was about to get a very expensive education from my own attorney, Prescott, who had strategically requested an optional, non-legally binding mediation pre-conference just to get Duffy in a closed room and lay out our cards. When the Tuesday morning of the conference arrived at the county administration building, Prescott and I made a point of showing up early to set the tone. When Duffy finally strolled into the room, he carried a sleek leather portfolio and the smug, practiced confidence of a high-priced city lawyer who assumed a dispute in rural Tennessee would be easy money. But Prescott immediately took control of the room, opening up with our detailed harassment log that tracked 11 separate complaints filed against me over 2 long years, every single one of which had been dismissed, but had cost me thousands in legal fees. Duffy just nodded along smoothly, acting like he was just taking notes, until Prescott quietly slid the certified Ridgecrest Development Agreement across the table, with the non-harassment clause highlighted in bright yellow. Prescott did not say a word, simply letting the document speak for itself as Duffy read it once, then read it again much slower, before abruptly requesting a 5-minute recess. If you and I had been out in that hallway, we would have watched that 5 minutes stretch into a tense 23 minutes. According to Taft, who was waiting in the corridor to keep official track of the timeline, those 23 minutes consisted of at least 2 frantic phone calls and long stretches of heavy silence. When Duffy finally walked back into the conference room, his expensive leather portfolio was still open, but his entire posture had completely changed from smug confidence to defensive posturing. Prescott was running the show now, and Duffy knew it, haltingly claiming that his client had never been made aware of that specific covenant provision. Prescott did not skip a beat, reminding him that any lack of communication was strictly between his client and Ridgecrest Properties. He pointed out that 11 documented actions had directly violated a legally binding covenant, and that the developers had already been sent copies of everything that very morning. Beverly sat there in stony silence, trying to keep her face neutral, while Thad sat at the end of the table, staring down at his hands. With a steady voice, Prescott began reading our list of strict, non-negotiable terms directly from his prepared statement. We demanded an immediate halt to all association actions targeting my farm, a formal and public retraction of her defamatory Facebook post, a financial settlement to cover 2 years of my accumulated legal fees, and a written reaffirmation of the non-harassment covenant officially recorded with the county. When Duffy hesitantly asked for 2 weeks to review everything with his client, Prescott shut him down instantly, giving him exactly 1 week. He reminded the lawyer that Beverly's rezoning petition was already scheduled on the County Board of Supervisors' agenda for the 14th of the month. Prescott made it clear that we wanted this settled before that public hearing took place, or else our entire file of documentation would be submitted as a formal response, entering the permanent public record for everyone to see. That final detail about the rezoning petition was the absolute game changer that completely shifted the leverage in our favor. It turned out Beverly had foolishly filed that petition on the exact same day she parked her car on my land, trying to execute a land grab while simultaneously trespassing. Because a county petition immediately becomes a matter of public record, allowing it to proceed to a hearing meant Prescott's entire file, including the covenant violations, the defamation, and the 11 dismissed harassment complaints, would be permanently archived for anyone to read. The high-powered corporate lawyers representing Ridgecrest Properties, who had been blowing up Duffy's phone during his 23-minute recess, were absolutely terrified of this outcome. Having a legally binding public record showing their homeowners association had spent 2 years violating county agreements was the absolute last thing they wanted attached to their pending Phase 2 expansion plans. Here's the major lesson I learned from this whole ordeal. When a developer or an HOA files a formal action against your land, it becomes a permanent public document, and your counter-documentation filed in response does too. That kind of leverage is incredibly powerful, and you must use it to protect yourself. As we were finally leaving the building, Thad actually held the door open for me, keeping his eyes on the ground. When I muttered a quick thank you, he gave me the tiniest nod, just 2 millimeters of movement, but it spoke absolute volumes. 4 days after that, Duffy called Prescott to concede that Beverly was ready to sign the settlement because her time had officially run out. The upcoming Harlan County Board of Supervisors meeting on February 14th was originally supposed to be a boring, routine session about road repairs and budget items that would normally only draw about 20 people to the local community center on a cold Thursday night. Due to the mandatory public notice for the rezoning petition and Glenwood's brilliant front-page article in the Herald Citizen highlighting our 2-year battle, the community center was absolutely packed. When I walked through the double doors at exactly 6:45 p.m., there were easily 140 people crammed into the room. Metal folding chairs borrowed from the local Methodist church were lined up 3 deep against the walls to accommodate the massive crowd. The entire space smelled of cheap drip coffee from the old metal percolator in the corner, damp winter coats, and that unmistakable, highly charged energy of a small town that has decided to stand up for one of its own. Looking around the room, I saw faces I had not seen in years, all gathered there in the warmth. They were old neighbors, cattle farmers from the east side of the county, and small business owners from Main Street, all sitting side by side. Dorrance had taken a seat in the second row, while Odell kept watch from the very back of the hall, and Reva sat with her thick research binder resting on her lap. Prescott wore his one good court suit, looking exactly like a seasoned country lawyer who had spent 50 years preparing for moments just like this. Beverly sat in the front row next to Cortland, while Thad was nowhere near her posture stiff and her face holding that blank expression lawyers always recommend to mimic calm. But what she did not realize, and what I had intentionally kept secret, was that her settlement forced her to formally and verbally withdraw her petition right there on the public record, in front of the entire town. You and I both know there is nothing quite like watching a bully have to publicly state their own defeat. Looking back, I remember the absolute silence in that room just before everything went down. My lawyer, Prescott, had been completely unyielding when their attorney, Duffy, tried to negotiate a quiet written withdrawal through the county clerk's office. Prescott's exact words, which Taft later repeated to me, were simple. This petition was filed publicly, announced publicly, and used to damage my client's reputation publicly. It needs to be withdrawn publicly, on the record, in the same forum where this community's business is conducted. That is not negotiable. Rather than face our lawsuit, Beverly had reluctantly agreed. Now she sat in the very front row, right before the county board and 140 watchful neighbors, with Glenwood readying his camera. When the gavel finally struck to open the meeting, the standard county business cleared out with an unusual, almost hurried rhythm. It felt like even the board members knew exactly why the gallery was packed that evening. Then, Supervisor Holt Braddock, a lifelong cattleman in his 60s who had run cattle with my late father and carried the calm authority of a man elected 7 times without a real challenger, called up the rezoning petition. The entire room fell into that heavy, expectant silence you only get when people have been waiting months for a resolution. He announced that they had received a formal withdrawal from the petitioner and called her name. Beverly stood up, clutching her prepared statement, desperately trying to spin her retreat as a strategic pivot instead of a total surrender. Listening to her speak, I could hear how carefully she had rehearsed every single word of that speech. She claimed that after reflection, she was withdrawing the petition to focus on internal homeowners association governance rather than outside regulatory affairs. It was a calculated attempt to sound dignified, but it fell flat. Supervisor Braddock simply nodded once, officially recording the withdrawal, and then added that the Warden property would remain classified for agricultural use, just as it had been since 1951. He didn't have to read that history into the record, but he chose to. When he finished, a massive collective sigh of relief swept through the room, releasing 2 years of heavy built-up tension. That sound of relief was the weight of a 2-year struggle finally lifting from our shoulders. If you have ever fought for your home, you know how heavy that pressure can get. In the back of the room, Glenwood was already scribbling in his notepad while his photographer adjusted his lens. The front page story in the Herald-Citizen the next morning featured a picture of us standing in the gravel parking lot. Me, Dorrance, and Prescott in our heavy winter coats, looking like 3 tired men who had put in a hard day of honest labor. Before leaving, I spoke with Glenwood for about 10 minutes, telling him what I had carried for 2 long years. This land belonged to my grandfather, then my father, and now it belongs to me. One day, this acreage will belong to whoever in my family takes over after I am gone. This soil grows things. It has done so since 1951, and I fully intend to keep it that way. I have never been a difficult man, nor do I actively seek out conflict, but I am absolutely not selling this place, and I am not moving. Anyone who spends 2 years filing baseless complaints against a family farm, only to park their vehicle on my property without permission, is going to learn exactly how patient I can be. I keep immaculate records, and I have a very capable attorney. When Glenwood asked if he could quote me on that, I told him, please do. By March, we finalized a settlement that covered all my legal fees and paid out damages for the disruption. As part of our agreement, Ridgecrest Properties had to issue a formal, written reaffirmation of the Peaceful Use Covenant, which we filed directly with the county recorder as a permanent public document. Anyone who owns adjacent land can easily look up that binding document today. Furthermore, those malicious social media posts were deleted and replaced with an official retraction issued by the Homeowners Association Board itself. Beverly did not sign it, as she had resigned from her position as president just 3 days after our victory at the county meeting. Her successor, a reasonable man named Wallace, called me the week after taking office to clear the air, assuring me that the vast majority of my neighbors had no part in what she had done. Wallace asked if we could start over, and I answered him with complete honesty. You see, my issue had never been with the folks living in Sunrise Estates, but rather with a highly targeted campaign orchestrated by one vindictive individual to push a corporate development agenda. Wallace understood my position entirely, and we shook hands on it. By April, the Pruitts had put a sign in their yard and listed their house for sale. I never asked where they moved, and looking back, I realize I still do not care. Today, Ridgecrest Properties remains under scrutiny by the county attorney for violating the covenant, specifically regarding whether their collusion with the association violated their original 2016 development agreement. That official county investigation is still active and completely open to the public if you choose to search the Harlan County records for the Ridgecrest Properties Covenant Review. But looking back, there is one particular decision I made during this process that brings me the most pride. Once my legal bills were fully settled in April, Prescott and I sat down to discuss the remaining settlement funds. I had been quietly working on an idea since January, back during those freezing winter nights when I was planning our defense in the quiet of the equipment barn. I kept coming back to the core of the struggle. This was never about the money. It was about whether a family farm has a right to exist, to feed neighbors, and to keep land wild. It was about ensuring the next generation actually has a viable path to return to this demanding work. To make that happen, we set up the Warden Agricultural Scholarship, which is managed directly by the Harlan County Community Foundation. Every year, it awards 2 local students, prioritizing children from farming backgrounds, full in-state tuition for 1 year at the University of Tennessee College of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources. In May, we announced our first 2 recipients. One is a 19-year-old from an Eastern County cattle farm who plans to manage her family's herd, and the other is a 17-year-old from an orchard family who is going to study agricultural business. When those two young people shook my hand and thanked me, I gave them the exact advice my grandfather would have passed down. The land does not owe you a single thing. You work it with respect, you care for it, and you leave it better than you found it. As I look out over my fields now, the winter wheat is coming in strong with beautiful color and weight. The new drainage ditch works exactly as planned, and the cattle are thick on the fresh spring pasture. The old tow truck scars in the south pasture are finally healing over, and Grit is asleep under my truck while I wrap up the evening's paperwork on the porch. The excavator is safely parked back in the barn, and peace has returned to my land.